This week I read an interesting article by a late American theologian, John Grandelsky. This theologian confesses, he says, that he's tired, and often very angry, with those who assume that the decline of the church is inevitable. He speaks naturally of his country, but possibly it can be extended to other nations, although he says that not everywhere this decline is the same, even though he does not name it. For example, there is the case of Africa, which has nothing to do with what is happening in the rest. Grandelsky, when he talks about this, divides those who accept the decline of the church into two groups: the passive ones, those who limit themselves to observe the numbers that year after year are getting worse and do nothing, and the active ones, who are those who even collaborate in some way to make the decline more and more pronounced, and writes in his article this theologian: in the real world, when your organization shrinks 68% from 1981 to 2024, you fire the management team responsible for this achievement. He says, really, dismissing their vision and starting over. And instead, Grandelsky goes on to say, retired 90-year-olds continue to govern the church. His words, still convinced that the renewal was correct. The situation is not unique to the United States. For example, in Spain, at the beginning of the 60s, when the Second Vatican Council began, there were in the Spanish seminaries, diocesan seminaries, more than 7,000 seminarians. 10 years later, they had dropped to 1,500. Today, they do not reach 1,000 at this moment in the Spanish seminaries, including those who come from the neo-catechumenal seminaries. It is a situation worth reflecting on. Also, this week, I read an article published in the American news agency AP News by a journalist, not necessarily Catholic. I do not know what denomination he is, but he has reported on the evolution of the church in the United States in recent times. Tim Sullivan. This journalist, Sullivan, starts from a concrete fact: a parish in the state of Wisconsin. In this parish, which he says has been run for 40 years by liberals, new young conservative priests have arrived. The music has changed. Now it is Gregorian music in Latin during the masses. The homilies have changed. For example, there is more and more talk about the need of confession, also of God's mercy, but together with forgiveness, and he says, there is talk of eternal life, of heaven, of hell. And that has caused a real shock to some of the parishioners. But nevertheless, that revolution, after 40 years from a liberal line to a conservative line, is attracting more parishioners, and the journalist, Mr. Sullivan, says that this is not an exceptional case, but it is happening in many other places in the United States. He writes, generations of American Catholics are giving way to religious conservatives who believe that a change has twisted the church. The liberal priests who dominated the U.S. church in the post-Vatican II years are now in the 70s and 80s. Many are retired, some have died. Younger priests, poll shows, are much more conservative. Also this week, still in the United States, there have been some statements by Cardinal Cupic of Chicago. Cardinal Cupic, among other things, spoke about the situation of the church, the post-conciliar renewal, and said that it is an example and a reference of how this renewal has been done and how it should continue to be done. A book written by Cardinal Jules in 1974. 50 years have passed, and Cardinal Cupic is still proposing as a model a book that was original and revolutionary then, but that its application has given way to how we're living now. He is proving right what Grandelsky said about the 90-year-olds, who continue to lead the church, even though Cupic is not yet 90 years old. Also this week, and still in the United States, a terrible news has come to the light. With permission of a judge, the police have entered all the offices of the Diocese of St. Louis to investigate an alleged plot of trafficking minors for sexual abuse, no longer of an abused priest, but a plot consented to at least by the diocese itself, and they are reviewing and turning upside down all the documents of the diocese. This arises as a result of a complaint against a priest, now still pending trial, who allegedly abused a teenager in the 70s. That is, also many years have passed, but just in that decade, when the Second Vatican Council was already being applied, is when the liberalization in moral standards, not officially but in practice. To say that the application of the Second Vatican Council has favored pederasty seems unfair to me. But to confirm that indeed, at least in some places, the relaxation of moral requirements has led to an increase of pederasty, not that it did not exist before, but it has occurred that in most of the acts committed and abuse of minors took place in those years. That is simply a reality. It is not a secret. I am not going to say the diocese, but well, it is a very well-known diocese that today has a cardinal at the head, although at the time I'm going to talk about, this gentleman was not at the head of the diocese. That diocese organized a house, a kind of shelter for seminarians who had been expelled from Colombian seminaries. The house was also in Colombia. Seminarians who had been expelled from Colombian seminaries for being practicing homosexuals, and they were brought with them with their visa to the US and distributed them in different seminaries of the diocese. A few years later, when the affair broke out, they closed that house in Colombia. But this has existed. And if we not, we have to remember what happened, for example, with the Bishop of Buffalo in upstate New York. Is insisting today on applying the same methods that were applied 50 years ago the most opportune thing to do? Shouldn't we ask ourselves whether things that were discarded were perhaps wasted because they could still be useful? Many wonder if, in order to have a future, we should not go back to the past. In any case, it is probably necessary to recover at least to some things that were the past, because to insist on applying the same methods that are leading the Church to failure is agree with Gandelsky, and to say that governed by 90 years old and in a normal company after this failure they would have been put to the street. To throw things out when at least in part they have worked is a very serious mistake. I do not know if we have to go back to the past to have a future. But I believe that there are things from the past that worked and that should be recovered. It seems to me the most correct thing to do. Let us continue praying. Until next week, God willing.